Okay, this is going to be a somewhat slightly more complex example of conditionals and nested conditionals. So in this problem, we're going to write a function that determines what your grade is going to be in the class. Now, my dad tells a story of when he was in middle school. This is a long time ago, and said he had a teacher who was eventually fired because he gave all A's to students sitting in row 1, all B's to students sitting in row 2, and so forth through the 5th row, and that's how he determined grades for the class. Let's do something equally ridiculous here. We're going to determine your grade by the row you sit in, whether it's row 1 or 2, by your birth month, and by your major. So here's the rules we're going to implement. Those sitting in row 1 get 20% towards their total grade. Those sitting in row 2 get 10%. Those born in later months get up to a 60% maximum, meaning if you're born in December, you'll get 60% towards your grade. And those born in January would get 5%, and everything in between. Lastly, those who are in the IS major get 20%, all other majors get 10%. So let's write a function to run this. Alt F11, open your VBA editor. Let's get past the example we just finished previously and come down here and make a new one. Sub determine grade. Okay, let's make a few variables to collect the inputs and produce the outputs from the page. So let's dim row as integer. Birth month, that will also be an integer, so let's call it B month as integer. And then major will be a string, dim major as string. Okay, next, let's remember our input processing output model. Okay, next step, let's collect our inputs. Row is going to equal range, looks like that's B3 dot value. Let's set birth month equal to range B4 and major as B5. Alright, down here in the processing, let's start with our if block. Now there's 20 different ways at least that we can create this. I'm going to pick one or two and change them around so you can see. So first of all, if they get, if they're in row 1, let's say if row equals 1, then their total grade. So we need to keep track of total grade. Their total grade is going to get 10%, or excuse me, 20% towards their final grade. Let me end this if here, and let's make a new variable up here at the top to keep track of grade. Dim grade as, and let's make this an integer. So if row equals 1, then grade is going to equal, I'm going to do something here that you'll see a lot in programming. Grade equals grade itself plus, 20. So let's run this program and let me show you exactly what's happening here. F8 or Command-Shift-I if you're on a Mac. F8 again. Row is initialized. Let's put some values in here first. Stop that. Let's put in 1 for row, 2 for birth month, accounting for major. That's good for now. Let's run this again. F8 or Command-Shift-I. There we go. Row is initialized to 1, birth month to 2, major to accounting. Okay, if block. If row equals 1, let's hit F8, and yes it does, so it goes inside of that if block. Grade equals grade plus 20. Well, what is grade currently? It's set to 0. So essentially this is setting grade equal to 20. But we're going to use this the same format to keep a running total of what the grade is later on. So now grade's 20. So far so good. Alright, let's move this down a bit. Come on. Okay. If row is not row 1, it has to be row 2, right? So can we just put an else here and say then grade equals grade plus 10? Well, here's the problem with that. You may already have noticed this. Let's run this, or actually let's change this over here to row 4. Alright, F8. Okay, we've initialized everything. Row 1, it doesn't equal 1, so it skips that. Else, okay, it's 4, right? So if it's not row 1, then anything else, regardless of whether or not it's row 2 or anything, they're going to get 10%. Well, that actually doesn't follow the rules. If row 1 gets 20% and row 2 gets 10%, every other row gets 0%. So let's edit this a bit. Let's hit stop. And we're going to have to change this to else if row equals 2, then grade equals that. Whoops, else if row equals 2, then. Don't forget, every time you have an if, whether it's up here or an end else if, there has to be a then. Only time you don't need an n is if there is no other condition, if it's an else. So no if here, no condition, no then needed. So if it's 1, they get 20. If it's 2, they get 10. Otherwise, they get nothing. All right, next rule. Those born in later months get up to 60%. All right, that could be a little complicated. All right, let's think of how we want to do this. So we could come down here and put another if block entirely. All right, let's change this to, let's add an if b month equals 1, then grade equals grade plus, okay, if we're trying to space this out depending on the month, let's say you get 5% for, grade plus 5 for January, then we're going to have to copy our else ifs down. If b month equals 2, then I'm going to put my end if down here, then grade equals grade plus 10, and we're going to have to continue that else if through all 12 months. All right, stop and think a second. Is there a better way to do this possibly? So yes, there probably is a better way. However, if you're on an exam, in my class at least, and you're simply trying to meet the objectives of this, and you decide, hey, the fastest way for me to do this is to make this big, long if, else if, with 12 different months in it, that is fine with me. But let me show you another option. Instead of using an else if block, let's simply create a formula where after we've decided if they get what they get for the row they're sitting on, instead we'll say grade is going to equal grade plus, and then let's take the month, birth month, and multiply that by 5. Okay, think about that for a second. Will that work? So we take the 10 or 20 points or 0 points we got for this and add to that. So this is going to say grade equals what it used to equal, which is 10, 20, or 0, plus whatever their birth month is times 5. So if they're born in December, that's going to give them 60. That works here for our requirement. Or if it's in January, it'll give them 5. So that covers the birth month issue. Last one then, let's say if major equals is, then grade equals grade plus 20, and then it says all other majors gets 10. Whoops, we got a few typos here. Yes, I'll fix it, thanks. Okay, let's run this. Let's output to cell B7. Equals, and what we're going to put here, it will be whatever the resulting grade is. Reagan, let's fix that. Okay, F8 or Command Shift I if you're on a Mac. Let's step through this. We've set row, birth month, major. Row is not 1 or 2, therefore goes to else. So here's my question. Do we need this else at all? If we get here and it's not 1 or not 2, if I hit F8 again, it goes to the end. Do we even need a chance to put in an else? No, we don't. So what I'm going to do to make this code a little bit more efficient is get rid of that else block entirely. Okay? Now grade month is 2, so it should add 10 to our overall grade. Right now grade's at 0 because we weren't on row 1 or 2, so hit F8. Sure enough, it adds 10 to the score. Major, we put accounting, so it's not going to be 20. It's going to skip over that and go to else, add 10 to it, and if, and let's output our grade as 20%. So let's make this harder. This is actually not so bad. I'm going to stop this and change the rules a bit. Let's say row 1 gets a 20, row 2 gets a 10, but those who are in the IAS major get an automatic 100%. All others get, we'll give them 50%. So an automatic 100% means regardless of what their row, birth month, or birth month is. Okay, so there's a few ways we can do this. Let's one way we can do this is say if major equals IS, well, we can change this right here and say grade. It's no longer grade plus something, it's simply 100. Otherwise, we add 50 to the score. That would work. Let's play. So 60, that means we got a 50 because we're not IS. We got 10 for being in this birth month. That looks right. However, let's change the rules again. Let's say back here that no longer do we get the automatic 100 simply for being an IS major. Let's go back to 50 here again. Those born those in IS major get 50%. All others get 30%. Let's make a more complex rule. Those in the IS major and born in February and sitting on row, I don't know, 1 get an automatic 100%. Okay, now it's just getting ridiculous. What I want you to do though is practice having multiple criteria at once. So we've made it all through all of these. We can play the function. Oops, I have a typo there. Okay, everything works great. There are probably more efficient ways to do this, but I'm just going to simply come down here and let's make a criteria that that has to meet all of these, or conditional has to meet all of these criteria. So let's say after all is said and done, if major equals IS, now we're going to do something else. We're going to say and row equals 1 and what's our other one? Here we go. B month equals 2. Then we're going to simply say grade equals 100. And if. Oh, let's take that back. Oh, I forgot to change these ones back. Grade equals grade plus 50, and then this one I changed to 30. There we go. Okay, so what you see here is condition 1, condition 2, and condition 3. Now, if you're watching this as part of our class, you remember back when we did queries. We could have multiple criteria in a query, and whenever we use the keyword and, we're basically restricting or making it more and more difficult to make this overall condition true. So all 3 of these have to be met in order for this condition to equal true. If any one of them is not met, the entire thing is false. So let's play this. Grade is 40. Let's now put in these criteria. Row equals 1. Alright, let's play that. 60, that makes sense. Row 1 gets a 20. Born in February here gets a 10. So that gets us to 30. And then we're a non-IS major, that gets us another 30, that gets us to 60. So we need to change a couple more things. Our birth month is 2, but our major here is not IS. Let's change that to IS. Now without this, the total should be, 80. But with this now, this grade equals 100 is going to overwrite. Notice it's not grade equals grade plus something, it's grade equals 100. It's going to overwrite whatever the grade calculation was in these previous steps. So let's F8 or Command Shift I, go in, initialize our variables. Row does equal 1, so we get 20 points in grade for that. See, grade just turned to 20. F8 again. We get 10 points, so now we're up to grade equals 30 for being born in February. We are IS, so now we get an extra 50, and we're up to 80. F8 again, and now all three of these criteria are met, so it's going to overwrite that grade equals 80 down there with grade equals 100. Write it out to B7, and there's our sub. So, keyword and, you can have as many criteria in one single line as you want. If you can also use the keyword or. What this would do would say, okay, if their major is IS, or if both of these are met. And sometimes it helps just to put a couple of parentheses around ands just to help you keep it straight in your mind here. If major is IS, it'll set grade to 100. Or if both row equals 1 and birth month equals 2, then it'll set it to 100. This may not be what you want. I just want to show you an example of how these things work. But you can have multiple ors and ands with multiple criteria. These can get fairly complex. All right, one other thing we haven't done is nest ifs inside of other ifs. Okay, let's change these entirely here. I'm going to get rid of those rules, and I'm going to get rid of all of these. So let's make up some new rules here that are going to allow us or require us to nest a couple of ifs together. Okay, just pause and add a few new criteria here. So now instead of dealing with percentages, we're going to use letter grades. If you're sitting in row 1, born in June or later, you get an A. Born before June, you get a B. Sitting in row 2 and you're an IS major, you get a C. Any other major, you get a D. All right, let's create that one. First, let's start with an if. And I've kind of made it a little too easy for you here. Our outer if, let's decide or determine whether or not you're in row 1 or 2. So if row equals 1, then else. Now, should we do an else or an else if? It depends. Can they enter something other than a 1 or a 2? Yes, they can. So we don't have a radio button here that just has 2 options, or a drop-down list with 2 options. They can enter anything here they want. So let's do an else if row equals 2, then. And lastly, let's have an else and then an end if. Okay, row 1. Well, no, let's handle this last condition here first. If they don't enter row 1 or 2, let's just pop open a message box that says, sorry you fail. Or, actually even better, let's just put an F directly in that box. B7 equals F. Okay, so if they're sitting in row 1, were they born in June or later? So when the compiler comes here and evaluates this criteria row 1, if it's true, it processes everything in between these 2 lines, if and else if. Doesn't matter if there's 1 line or if there's 5, it's going to process everything that occurs in between these 2. Similarly, if it finds that this condition is true, it's going to process everything between those 2 lines. So what we can do is actually nest an entire another conditional inside of this conditional. So I'm going to have another if and say if, let's see, the criteria is born in June or later. Okay, so if B month equals, or I should say greater than or equal to 6, then, and let's come down here, have an else if B month, now they could enter a negative number, right? Or something else that's above 12, they could enter something wrong entirely. Should we handle all those possible errors? Well, we could. Let's say if B month, now that we've learned how to use multiple criteria on a line, let's say if B month is greater than 0 and B month less than 6, then this is going to be those born from January through May. Up here, maybe we should handle those possible errors of someone entering in a number greater than 12. So if birth month is greater than 6 and B month is less than 13, or you could say less than or equal to 12, either one would be fine. Then let's have an else down here to catch those who mistype, and then we still need to end that if. This is why nesting is so important. It's a lot easier to see that this end if closes this if than if we had nested them all equally with this parent if. So range B7. In this case, they're going to get an A. In this case, they're going to get a B. And in this case, if they don't know how to enter a month between 1 and 12, you can decide we can put whatever you want. Maybe we can just put an F, or we can give them some message that says, learn how to enter a month or something like that. Okay, that takes care of these first two options. Now, if it's in row 2, we can enter another if block right down here. So if they, let's see, major equals IS, then, now let's handle errors. What if they enter a major that's not one of those we listed? Let's take care of it. So else if major equals accounting or major equals finance or you have to learn how to spell major correctly, or major equals, and you get the picture. Marketing, I'm not going to finish the rest of them. You can put them all there in a list. If it equals one of those, then one more else, and then an end if. Okay, if major equals IS, and they're in row 2, our instructions say they get a C, no problem. All other majors, they get a D, and if they don't enter one of those majors at all, they get an F. I think that covers it. So it's 2 levels deep, an outer if, a nested if in each of these. Let's hit play, see what happens. Okay, grade is set to 0. Let's find my bug. Alright, hit F8 or Command Shift I, and let's go through one at a time. So row is set to 1, birth month is set to 2, major is set to IS. Row equals 1, so it's going to go inside of that if block. And it says is birth month between 6 and 13. No, it's not, so it should go to the next one, which it does. Is it greater than 0 and less than 6? It is, so it should go into here and set range equal to B, which it does. Then it skips the end of the if block. And, oh, we're doing our output right here, where we're writing out the value of grade. Well, I skipped a step. What I should have done in each of these is said, instead of saying range equals these things, I can say grade equals these things. Also, I wasn't using the dot value like I should, so let's go ahead and change these to grade, grade. There we go. So we'll set not that range equal to those letters, but we'll set the variable grade equal to those letters. Now grade, unfortunately, though, is an integer. All we need to do is change that to a string now. Whoops. Yes, reset the project and correct my spelling. Alright, play it now. There we go, grade is a B. Let's change this up. Birth month is in July. Play, we should now have an A, good. Even if it's June, we should have an A. Good. Let's go to row 2. And now in row 2, notice, does row 2 even care what the birth month is? No. Once it's row 2, none of the birth month criteria is even considered. And that's fine, it meets the rules. As long as it meets the rules, that's what we care about. Same thing, row month totally ignores major. Lastly, let's get ourselves an F somehow. Let's put in a birth month of -1. And if we do that, we're going to have to change row to 1, because remember, when we're in row 2, it's not even considering birth month. So row 1, birth month is -1. That should give us an F. Let's try that out. Yep, sure enough, an F. Okay, that concludes this long practice on advanced conditionals.